Welcome to the First Friday Entrepreneurship Call with K-State Research and Extension. The First Friday call was a brainchild of the K-State Research and Extension agents whose role is community vitality. And often we talk about the nurturing the small businesses and inspiring entrepreneurship in communities across the state. But we just can't hardly talk about entrepreneurship without having healthy communities around them. And so today we are just thrilled to have Ben Winchester. He was with us last March and made the plan to be with us this March at the same time. Just a reminder too that after Ben's call, Ben, you expect to take the whole 60 minutes, don't you? Okay. Oh, you are mute for. So, yep. Okay. But after the call, if there's anything you want to stay on and share from the rest of you, that is the role of this call, is to have a time for sharing. And so without further ado, Ben Winchester is a rural sociologist and extension educator and researcher from the University of Minnesota, as if that wasn't perfectly obvious to you. And today his topic is baby boomers and the rural housing supply. Take it away, Ben.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Nancy, and thanks for the invitation to be back here again this year, or later in this year. I don't know how many of you had seen the previous presentation, but a lot of the work I do is around the rural narrative, and kind of the premise of really the research I've done over the past 20, 25 years has been that the narrative that we use to describe our small towns and rural places is terrible. It's just not good. A lot of times it's based upon the past and what we had and what we could have had. And really, the research I do is what we in Extension call applied research. We need to make sure that the research we do is applicable and meaningful to people in small towns. So it's really my honor to be here to share kind of where I've been on this path with regards to housing. I want to start and just let you all know that I am not a housing expert. I'm a data guy, but ultimately the data kind of points in a lot of different directions here. That's very interesting. So I'll just start off by saying this, by the end of this presentation, you can't say you don't see this coming, right? Okay, so I'm just gonna start with that, but I've got a PowerPoint. I'm gonna get up here and share this. Hold on one second. I need to swap this around here. Okay, so this presentation really started, again, I would hear a lot of things from people in different communities talking about, we've got a workforce housing shortage. I think you all hear this too, right? We've got a workforce housing shortage. There aren't enough houses for people to move into, and, which obviously doesn't make a lot of sense because, if all our small towns are dying, like there should be plenty of homes for sale. There should be homes all over the place, but there really aren't. And why aren't there? And I would argue it's because, this narrative about rural, this kind of, this heartland narrative is that we're all in flyover country. There's an entire book called Postcards from Flyover Country. I mean, it's really about, the narrative of our rural communities is pretty terrible, and it's all around like here is a headline, like the slow agonizing death of the small U.S. town. Like none of this sounds good. None of this is really optimistic, and that's
Ben,
not to say. Yep.
Ben, can I? We're only seeing a part of the screen again.
Oh, weird. Okay, let me.
I can see about the right half.
Oh, really?
Okay. I mean, if necessary, this isn't horrible.
You see both of them though, right?
Yeah, we do.
Sets? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's better. Yeah, that's better. We're missing a little bit of the right side and a little bit of the top. I can read Heartland is changing, not D.
Not dying. Okay, sorry, folks. I don't know what's going on.
We had this all fixed before you got here.
We did. It was great.
It was fantastic. Sorry you missed it.
Here, we'll just try this one more time.
I'm even having trouble with my speaker view, so I apologize.
Oh, right.
Maybe you're seeing the right thing, but I'm not.
Is that any better?
Yes, it is better. Yes. Yes.
Okay. So really, if you haven't seen the first presentation, I'm sure we can get the link out to you, but I'm going to briefly kind of review, we have gone through tremendous negative changes, I would argue, in our rural communities. The mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm workers by anywhere from 20 to 60% in some of our counties. And this led again to a depopulation of our small towns in the early 1900s. And at the same time, we started to have roads be introduced to our communities. So You know, the connections from one town to another really changed. And those two things really led to the rise of what we call regional centers. You know where they are today. We live in a much more regional life than ever before. I kind of comically say this isn't Little House on the Prairie anymore, like where you're isolated and you don't really, you go into town a few times a month. Once we introduced cars, this literally changed everything with regards to how our small towns saw themselves and how they connected with one another. And by the time we hit the 1950s, there's this, I would argue there's kind of this idyllic view, of what small towns are. And I'm going to get my laser pointer here. And I think this is the Norman Rockwellish kind of view of small towns, right? That you've got a main street and it's filled and you've got people everywhere. And, but honestly, that's not what our small towns look like today. We have moved much more to regional centers, and that's been the result of this Main Street restructuring. So, and I'll just say Main Street restructuring is a really kind way of saying businesses closed, right? Whether it's grocery stores or apothecaries or hardware stores. Like our small towns surely do not look like Sleepy Eye did early on. So as we have migrated many of our retail and manufacturing bases to regional centers, many of our small towns, quote unquote, lost out. We've closed a lot of places. And we still have remnants of the past, up and down Main Street. We've got boarded up buildings where, hospital, or for where our clinics used to be, or a hospital, or, the school used to be. We've also had things like school consolidations, and almost all of these, right, are major transformative impacts on our small towns, which lead us to believe that, when we close our hardware store, it's one more nail in the coffin. Now we're closing our grocery store, another nail in the coffin. And you would think that there's nothing left in our small towns and that nobody really wants to live there anymore. But really, we end up kind of catching ourselves up in this rural narrative about, there's a brain drain, when our high school kids leave. We live in the middle of nowhere. Like, we've got kind of these negative comments right in our back pocket. People still say like, oh, we're just a sleepy little town, like, hello, you are more awake than ever before. We are in an interconnected world, a global world. And then we've got other things too, these kind of very stereotypical comments that everybody knows one another when you don't. Like, nobody locks their doors when you do. And we're rife with stereotypes describing our rural communities. And in many times, even the narrative that we use ourselves in our small towns is based upon what we had, what we don't have, what we wish we had, what we could have had. When in fact, there are some really great trends happening in our small towns since the 1970s. But many times we believe total population is an indicator for success and failure. And I call this total population infatuation, right? We're going to have the new census come out here in a couple of years, right? Census being done this year. I encourage you all to get this done because your bodies, your people count here, and your people matter. So you want to make sure they get all counted. Well, regardless, usually when new census data comes out, people call me up and say, hey, I want a map of, who gained and who lost, right? So here's a map that, we commonly make. And if your county is a gradation of orange or maroon, that means you gained people, right? 0 to 10, 11 to 25, or more than 25%. They tend to be in the more suburban areas or outside the metros. And then in the counties in white are the counties that lost people overall. And it's framed this way, like you're a big loser if you lose people, right? When really, what is going on here? So I want to give you an example of, and I'll just say, try not to use total population as an indicator for your success or failure anymore. And here's why. Here's a 5-county region in western Minnesota. It's fairly rural. We got 5 counties with less than now 50,000 people in them. But if you look at their historical population from 1960 to today, their population went from 69,000 to 45,000, like down 35%. They're huge losers, right? But I'm saying that tongue in cheek. You can't see my face, but I'm saying this tongue in cheek. But when you look right below that, like, while the number of people have declined by 35%, the number of households in the region went up by 3%. Well, how can that be? How can the number of households actually go up? Well, what's happened is we end up with a smaller household size. So for example, in 1960, there were 60% of our households had 3 or more people in them. But by today, 2017, or a couple of years ago, right, it was down to 37%. We have much fewer people in our homes. On average, the average household size in this country has fallen from 3.6 in 1940 to 2.6 today. So Imagine your town has 100 houses. In 1940, those 100 homes would be home to 100 times 3.6, right? 360 people. But today, if you have those same 100 homes, they would only be home to 260 people. And that's not because you have all these people moving away. It's because the average household size has declined. You are going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the world. So what's happened, obviously the big one is the average family size has gone down. So, people used to have like 2.8 kids and now it's down to 1.6. Nobody has fractions, but you get the idea that on average, fewer kids then will reduce your population without an outmigration. But even between two time periods, right, that 2000 to 2010 map, what happens when this household with two kids and the two kids graduate and they move out? Well, your population just went down by 2, but your households stayed the same because those two kids were not homeowners, right? But the parents are still living in town. So the other situation we have, which is much more common today, is you have two seniors in a home and one of them passes away and the surviving spouse stays in that house. Well, now what happened is your population went down by 1, but your occupied households, again, stayed the same. So again, all of these kind of factors contribute to having fewer people but roughly the same number of homes in our communities. And when we look at a few counties across the landscape here, we look at the differential between population change and housing change. Allen County, your population went down by, and again, I'm going back to the older data here, but this is still true today in every county, even using the more recent data. There's a reason why I don't use American Community Survey data, which will give you data on average for every 5 years, is because their margin of error is so big it becomes useless in our smallest communities. So before you call me out on, oh, that's super old data, like I'm using this as an example, but it still holds true today. And what we find is these differentials, right? If this is your narrative, right, population change, but this is the reality in your communities. Like Decatur County, you lost 15% of your population, but the number of homes stayed the same. Graham County, population went down by 12%, but the number of homes only went down by 4. And you kind of see that's just a fraction. Like Lincoln and Logan, your populations went down by almost 10%, but you had a positive gain in homes. So telling the story for me is much more broad than just looking at people, because just looking at people doesn't tell you actually what's going on in your community. And we'll look at some of these. So really, y'all may be familiar with the transfer of wealth studies, and that is, we've got a lot of people who are going to be retiring, and the basic question here is what's going to happen to their wealth? Is it going to pass on? Is it going to stay in the community? Is it going to go on to their kids who may not live there anymore? And that's great on one side, and there's a lot of work to be done there. But all I keep thinking of is, if there is nowhere for people to live in your town, where will your future wealth actually reside, right? People actually have to live somewhere and they have to live in a home. So I want to shift an indicator of success from population to houses as an example here, and we'll see where this takes us, all right? So for me, housing stocks are a measure of community wealth. Though I'll just say, typically, we've got a laissez-faire approach to housing, that, we're just going to let people make their decisions, whatever that may be. And we'll look at the consequences of that. So basically, housing stocks, again, are a measure of community wealth, because not only is that house a home to somebody today, that house was a home to somebody before, and that house will be a home to somebody, hopefully, in the future. So again, I want to look at these homes as a great community asset that we've got. Those homes are also a home to individual wealth, and those homes also persist over time. They do not get up and walk away from your community like people do, right? If you got some people that want to live closer to their grandkids, there's nothing you can do about that. Well, and they're going to take their wealth with them, and other things that we'll look at here. So really, for me, small towns are changing. We're certainly not dying. Like, if any one of those, major structural changes were going to guarantee the death of our small town, we would have been dead long ago. Like, our landscape would have been littered with ghost towns by today if nobody had ever moved into them. So really, we have survived this really massive restructuring of social life in our rural and economic life in our rural communities. And I don't think we get enough and really pat ourselves on the back enough for this. Is that I want to remind you that slide, a couple slides back, about, we've closed schools, we closed hardware stores and grocery stores. Like, we're still here. And we're still here because of the leaders in our community. You know, we don't have big paid staffs to deal with all these massive structural changes. Like, we're still here because of your volunteer school boards, your volunteer chamber boards, your volunteer community betterment groups. Like, we are still here, and we should be celebrating that. So really, I want to say this. I want you to prepare for one of the biggest demographic changes to rural America since the mechanization of agriculture. Since we really shifted away from an agricultural base, this is what's going to happen. So just so you know, normally when I do this presentation at a community level, it's very important for me. I'm gonna stop this just for a minute. It's very important for me to get people to think in terms of housing, and not with your hat on, not with your economic development hat on, not with your HRA hat on, but to think about housing from a personal family decision-making point. So usually when I do a presentation at a community level, I start with roundtables. I don't even start with a presentation on myself. It's a roundtable where we have people share a story about, you know, what type of housing decisions have you had to make with regards to a family member. Right now, we want to make it personal because ultimately every decision around a house is a personal one. So let me go back to this here. Hopefully this works. Does that look all right? Please, Lord, I hope it does. Okay. So basically then in these breakouts, right, I give people 5 to 10 minutes to talk about this, is how many of you have had a personal experience with an older family member changing homes? What do you have control over? What didn't you have control over, right? And we'll look at some of these things, and really who should care about this issue? Because again, as I mentioned, like most of the time, these housing decisions happen independently, and we say, you know, let's just let people do whatever they're going to do, and when they're ready to move, they'll be ready to move. Well, the number of older people in this nation is, well, you know, even though we've got this kind of big hump in terms of baby boomers moving in, the number of people in this country doesn't decline after the baby boomers. It actually gets bigger. So we are only going to grow the number of seniors in our country, in our small towns, in our regional centers. It's not an episodic thing that we're going to deal with this for a little bit of time and then it'll be over. This is just the beginning of the major dramatic shift in the number of people that we've got, especially the proportion of the population that's older. So what's coming? So initially I just wanted to make a map to understand what percent of owner occupied homes. I'm not looking at renters here. I'm looking at owner occupied because they tend to be, you know, we tend to have higher home ownership rates in our rural communities. So this is the percentage of homes owned by trailing boomers. And I say trailing because a lot of times people throw baby boomers into one big bucket when really there's a large age discrepancy between the oldest and the youngest baby boomers. And there are some differentials in there. So we're going to split this apart just a little bit. So trailing boomers are the youngest boomers, okay? They're the ones that have barely retired right now. But we've also got leading boomers, and we see where they are. And you look at the differentials between them aren't huge. And we'll look at this another way too, but a lot of times it's around these metro areas that we have a higher percentage of people living as baby boomers, but that's mostly taken up because we have fewer people that are over the age of 75 in these areas. So this one is trailing boomers. Here are leading boomers, percentage of owner-occupied homes owned by leading boomers. And now here are the percentage of owner-occupied homes owned by people over the age of 75. Now you start to look at, you know, more than a third of the homes are owned by people over the age of 75. And this is the data that blew me away. I was like, holy cow. So initially, when I would get asked, like, don't we have a workforce housing shortage? Now, I mean, I used to be like, I guess so, you know, like, yeah, we can't find any homes. And then now my answer to this is, you know, we do have a workforce housing shortage, but not for long. Because ideally, when you think about this, like, if you're over the age of 75, you're not going to be in these homes forever. And these homes are going to open up for supply. So as our seniors age out and either move over or literally move on, we actually need to talk about death and dying here. So as people age out and as people pass on, their homes become available for your supply. So now what I'm saying is when you've got 35% of your homes owned by baby boomers in those darkest Burgundy counties, they're going to go on the market within the next 10 years, right? This is like we've barely had this experience before in our rural communities. So now we look at some differentials here. So there's a category between urban and rural that we can classify different counties in, right? Like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Wichita, like you're in these urban categories, and our most rural counties are located down here. And if you look at the percentage of owner-occupied homes that are occupied by trailing boomers or leading boomers, you notice there's not a real big difference here between rural and urban. It's about, 20%, 20 from 24 to 21 is not a huge difference to me. I'm a data guy. And some people will be like, it's significant, but is it really? Like it's 3? Okay, that's going to be somewhat small, especially when you look at the differentials of those age over 75. Now, there's a big difference. It's a quarter of homes in urban areas, but it's a third of homes in rural communities that are owned by people over the age of 75. And now when you start to add all these together, 77%, 75 to 77% of our rural homes are going to turn over in the next 20 years. We have never had this turnover before in our rural communities. So this begs like tons of questions, like how welcoming are we? What are the conditions of the home? Like this opens a Pandora's box. I kid you not, because this is where I've been for the past 4 years, is working on this housing issue and thinking about, then what? Now what? So again, as I mentioned, like workforce housing shortage, there's plenty of workforce housing. It's currently occupied by our seniors. So, we've got an opportunity here to move some of these homes over. So we end up with these kind of profiles of our counties. We're not going to go into great detail because they don't look significantly different from one county to another. But I just want you to examine a general trend. So like here's Cloud County, here are baby boomers, right? In the 2000s, baby boomers in 2010, and those two big bars are gonna move over here now because they're gonna get older. And more importantly, this is the piece I want you to see, and this is related to these numbers right here across the bottom. And this is the percentage of homes owned by people over the age of 75 and percentage of homes owned by baby boomers, 35% in Cloud County. Decatur County, 40% of your homes are owned by people over the age of 75. And then when we look in a little more detail, we see a decline in owner-occupied housing units, but almost all of the housing units are still there. The difference is some of those homes are now vacant. And why are they vacant? The most common situation we end up in is that seniors move out because they have to. They're like forced to because of some emergency. They move out and they like tell the kids, "What? Just hold on to the house. Like, I don't know what's going to happen yet." Right? Well, what happens when you bump up the number of vacant is these homes are no longer available for resupply. Like you actually don't have room for anybody to move in when the family is like, "Oh, I'll use the house as a vacation house," or "We're going to turn it into an Airbnb," or, there's all these situations that we end up in where the house is not for sale. It's not for rent. There's actually reductions in the number of homes here for sale and rent. That your housing is totally occupied, but now you're sitting on homes that are vacant for a variety of reasons. And we don't always know those exact reasons, but you can, go to your assessor and we can try to find out what's going on here. So really what's coming, like if there's all these homes that are going to go on the market, like, okay, so who's going to buy your 21 million homes, boomers, right? If we've had these millennials out there now, and they actually are very interested in rural homes because the cost of a rural home is much more significant. There is much lower than the cost of an urban home. But again, like if you've got 3/4 of your homes are going to hit the market in the next 20 years, now what? Like, are we heading for disaster, right? The next senior sell-off could cause the next housing crisis. Are there enough people to buy the homes that are going to go on the market over the next 10 years, next 20 years, right? These are the basic questions. So I want to frame this in with 3 ideas. One is moving in, which is the brain gain, which you may have heard already in the previous presentation. One is moving out. Sometimes people are going to move out of your community, and that will open up housing. Or we have opportunities for people to move over within a community, and that also opens up the supply. There's another situation that we end up in where people stay put, and we're going to talk about that too. So really, there are people moving in. There's a brain gain, and this has been well documented now, not just in Minnesota, but Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, all these different states. And the brain gain we call a movement of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that have been moving to our rural communities since the 70s, really. There's been a big influx of people in these age groups. So what we find is that there and again, I call it brain gain, because the negative narrative is around brain drain, right? When you lose your 18-year-olds and they move out, and I say, fine, let them move out, right? But they have to know that there's going to be a place they can come back to one day. So meanwhile, there is actually a well-worn path of people with an interest in living in rural communities. So in terms of moving in, our key message here is there is demand for rural homes, and that demand has not waned. It has only increased. That demand for rural homes, especially in the 90s, filled up almost all of our vacant housing stock that was available for sale or for rent. Now we end up with vacant housing stock that's not available for anybody to use, and there are some implications here. But really, this has been happening since the 70s. But what we have found too is that newcomers don't just look at your town. They generally look at kind of 3 to 5 different communities in a region, and they live these huge regional lives. So when we talk about like trying to bring people to our community, our key message here is talk positively about bringing people to your region, because when you bring more people to your region, everybody wins at this point, because very few people live and work and shop and play just in your town. Think about this. How big of a region do you go out to eat in and shop in and play in? I mean, it is vast. It goes up to 2 hours from your house. So when we ask these newcomers, why do you move into these small towns? The top 3 reasons people gave were, number 1 was simpler pace of life. The second top reason was safety and security. It's especially high with people with kids. And the third top reason was the low cost of housing. The low cost of housing. Now what we find is housing actually becomes one of these major factors that we should be concerned about. So maybe we should actually be paying some attention to our housing stocks a little bit more. So back with regards to this narrative, because again, the narrative is so negative, you would think nobody ever wants to live here, right? That everybody wants to live in the big cities, everybody's moving to the metros, when in fact, the Pew Research Institute did a study a number of years ago that asked Americans all right, Americans, we know that 80% of you live in the cities and 20% of you live in rural areas and small towns, but if you could live anywhere, where would you live? 51% of Americans said they'd prefer to live in a small town than a rural place. So there is a high demand for rural and small town living, whether we believe it or not, there actually is. But I would argue, why don't enough people look or even turn their attention to rural? I would argue the narrative is so negative they think they never could. I could never move to a rural community. Aren't you all dead? Or isn't it all ghost towns? Or right? I mean, it's just, people, this narrative is fairly pervasive. And even worse is we use it ourselves. So anyway, that's about the narrative. Again, you want to read up more about that, just hear more about that, we can get you a link to that previous presentation too. So kind of economically, we have shifted these regional centers, and that we hear pretty consistently, like, there just aren't a lot of housing options for the people that work here. And that we live in these regional lives, but really doesn't matter. Economically, you can live anywhere. We're seeing this now with the coronavirus, where we've got a large segment of the population that's encouraged to just stay home and work for those that can, right? Do that. And even so, like 8 to 12% of your workforce right now in your rural communities work from home. They never walk into your economic developer office because they don't need help. And a lot of times then, these people are never on your radar. You never see them as an actual employee because they don't walk into any brick and mortar place in your community. So they're almost invisible, and they get very little recognition as a contributor to your local economy. So again, like here's Mason City, Iowa as an example, like the number of people that commute in every day. But even in Mason City, you got 4,800 people moving out there. So this is a fairly common pattern for these regional centers, is that you're bringing in people from all around the regional center to work in this place, but at the same time, you still in regional centers have people commuting out to work in some of the small towns and rural places too. So there's really a new economic narrative around remote workers, kind of people focused, but the key point here is we're in a tight labor market and we have very few homes for sale. So even when labor is looking to move to your community and they go on realtor.com or Trulia to look for a house, you don't find much. Really. And you would think, again, that there's no homes there. Like, oh, they must be all, ghost towns. And that's why nobody wants their home for sale. When in fact, homes never go on the market. A lot of times we hear this very consistently. is that, hey, I heard John and Marcia were going to sell their house. Let's go talk to them. And then they end up being talked to, and that home never shows up on the market. And we kind of comically say right now that the best place to find a new home for sale or a home to go on the market is to go visit with people after church. I mean, talk to them about who's thinking about moving out and moving on or all those kinds of things. But really, we live in an economy, not in a community. And when it comes to recruiting employees, we have to help them envision their life here, because the job is not enough, especially in a tight labor market. Labor is going to have power. They got 3 to 5 options of places to move to. So when they've got all these options, what's going to differentiate one community from another is everything but the job. And again, we kind of talked about this in depth at the last call too. So the basic question here is, will home ownership continue? We do put a lot of value on home ownership, but it's declining. And why is it declining? I would argue it's declining because seniors are not moving out of their homes at the same rate that they used to. Never before has the older generation, the people over the age of 65, stayed in their home for so long. And it's not because they're living longer. It's that they used to move in with the kids, or the kids would move in with them. And, we used to have multi-generational homes. That used to be the norm. But now we had this kind of ideal around a nuclear household where you're successful. And I wonder if I've got this slide here. Right, here it is. So this is the number of multi-generational households in this country. And if you were to go back to 1900, it used to be the norm, right? Living by yourself in a house with your wife and kids was so 1950s ideal. Like, this is that nuclear household. And now we're back to seeing, again, where do America's 26-year-olds live? Who do they live with? Like with a spouse in the 80s, right? And now watch, with a parent, 19% jumping up, down to 45%, 42%, as we start to get into the 2000s, roommates, parents, there we go. 2016, we made the jump to now more 26-year-olds live with their parents than with their spouse ever before. So we're seeing a return to multi-generational housing. But really, when retirees and seniors move out, so I'm going to really focus on retirees and seniors, not just the baby boomers, but the people over the age of 75, the folks older than baby boomers. Sometimes these older folks are going to move out, and there's nothing you can do about that. They're going to want to move closer to grandkids, or sometimes people have medical needs. And really, if your small town doesn't have a clinic or a hospital, which many do not, right, they're going to move to more, regional centers to try to get those advanced services that they're not able to get in their smaller towns. But before we even get to kind of the medical situation, my argument here is that, before we get to the continuum of care, like when people need services, you have a whole continuum of life, right? From the age of 60, like you might have 10, 20 years of life before you hit the continuum of care. So I don't fall in with once you retire, let's move into the nursing home. Like, it doesn't happen like that, right? So this is the part that really does not get explored very much. And that is the preferences that people have. And I would argue that our seniors live in a world of best intentions. And that is, I'm going to live in my house forever. And that's an intention. But seniors also have other intentions that may or may not come true. So for example, when people are asked, like, when do you expect to retire? Most people are like, oh, I'm not retiring until after I'm 70. I'm going to keep working and keep working, like everybody over the age of 65. But in reality, those numbers are pretty much flipped. This is the difference between what you intend to do and what actually happens in your life. And as a data guy, intentions don't get you very far. As a policy person, you cannot make predictive models based upon intentions, right? Because if you're going by intentions, you're getting it all wrong. So essentially, people do retire early to the point they're sacrificing their retirement payments, right? You get a reduction in payments if you're retiring before standard retirement age. So meanwhile, right away, I just want to show off this differential between intentions and reality, because this will rear its ugly head again. Now, a lot of times people stay put, and this is, again, the policy of best intentions. And by the way, this isn't a policy. This is, I'm going to live in my house forever. So we end up with people saying, like, 90% of seniors say that I intend to stay in my home. But only 43% of those over the age of 70 found it easy to do so. Like, it really is not easy to stay in their home. When the AARP did this study here that asked people, like, why do you not move? Why are you not moving ever? Well, it's stressful, right? A fear of losing independence, anxiety of leaving your community. You've got emotional ties to the home, or really just fear of the unknown. Well, okay, that's great. But meanwhile, we've got folks who want to stay in their home. So it's a lot of times called aging in place. And I know you've heard about aging in place, but I do not want to confuse aging in place with aging in your house. They're two very different things. And a lot of times the research confounds all these things. These people are asked, like, do you want to stay in your home or in your community? And those two get confounded. When we did a survey, I lived in Hancock for a long time. We did a survey of all the seniors in our city and all the surrounding townships. And what we had found is that people are like, I don't know if I want to stay in my house, but I'd like to live in town on Main Street, you know, closer to the senior center or closer to the post office, closer to the cafe, like all of these things. So meanwhile, we actually have a lot of policies around aging in place. And most times it just means aging in your house, right? Which can be cheaper a lot of times long-term. And there's actually millions of dollars to keep people in their homes. And I'll argue this may not be the best thing for the people or the house. So we end up with situations like this, where seniors say, I'm going to live in my house forever. And hold on, I'm going to stop my share here. So essentially we end up with situations like this, where seniors say, I'm going to live in my house forever. So they make decisions based upon that intention. And what I mean by that is, you know, they end up saying, well, I'm going to update my bathroom and I'm going to put on a handicap ramp because I want to live here forever, right? So they do, and that costs them like $10,000 because it's not cheap, right? But it's livability, it's all this, right? Well, then something happens. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year down the road, 2 years down the road, where something happens that they can't live there anymore. And then now the family is called in, the senior's got to move over or move out or whatever it is. We'll talk about that. But meanwhile, the realtor comes up to the senior and the family and says, I want to help you sell your house, but you have knob and tube wiring in there. And, you know, knob and tube, there's hardly anybody that's going to insure that anymore. So you're going to have to replace that wiring. And by the way, you've got peeling paint. And, you know, first-time home buyer, you cannot have a single piece of peeling paint on that house, or you are not eligible for a first-time home buyer program. Well, now the senior is looking at $15,000 or $12,000 to do these things. And they're like, well, I just spent $10,000 updating the bathroom and putting on the ramp a year and a half ago. And we're like, well, that's not an asset builder. I hate to tell you this, right? So we've got to be Mr. Frank about things here. Number one, that's not an asset builder. In fact, that was just a livability expense that you had, because nobody in their checklist goes through and says, I need a handicap house, a handicap accessible, or I want a ramp on my house. Like, right, all this workforce people moving in, none of those things that you just spent all that money on is going to really make a difference here. So now, let me jump back here. So now the family is kind of stuck in a very difficult situation where they've got to outlay more money than they hoped. And now what could have been done differently in that situation? What could have been done differently 2 years ago, 3 years ago? So let me go back here. So we end up with situations again where aging in home long-term, because now if you're in that home forever, quote unquote, what happens when you're on a fixed income? Well, you're going to make some choices between having your medication or fixing up the house. And where does that go? Like, it goes to your medication. So a lot of times our home, this aging in your home long-term means you're lowering your equity if you're not doing maintenance or upgrades on the home, can actually result in dilapidation. And so now, again, we end up in a situation where we have a lot of public officials, and right, I work in the public sector too. Like, I have to have an argument as to why I do the work I do, and that it doesn't conflict with the private sector, right? And that it's got a public good to it. Because if this is all about a private decision, we should just let people do whatever they're going to do. Well, let's look at what happens if we just let people do what they're going to do. And my example here is like, I'm just going to stop this again for a second. My example here is I had lived in a house in Hancock, Minnesota, which was next door to Howard. And Howard passed away, God rest his soul. But when I moved in, our homes were built within a year of one another. But if you looked at them from the outside or the inside, you wouldn't know it. My house was kept up by the previous owners. His house was not. Like literally there is water damage throughout. There is knob and tube through the house. There's birds living in the eaves. Like it was terrible. And when he had passed away, if it were not for his daughter immediately moving into that house could never have been sold. It could have never transferred ownership. It would have been torn down and razed. Well, now what is the implication here of what happens if Howard's house, right, gets demolished? You know, what is the public cost of us doing nothing here? So the example is this. Imagine in your community you have 4 homes. I know this isn't true, but right? So 4 homes, and each of those homes currently brings in $1,000 in property tax revenue. And that property tax is derived from the land and the structure. But now if Howard's house gets torn down, you're only assessed on the land. Well, now what happens to Howard's assessment? It just went down by $800. Well, now does the county reduce its levy because Howard's house got demolished? Do they're like, oh, yep, Howard's house went down by $800. Let's reduce our levy. They don't, right? I mean, so now what happens? Who's paying for that $800 reduction? Everybody else in town is now going to pay. So now that, you know, that county earlier that had an influx of 140 vacant homes, what if half of those homes become dilapidated and have to be demolished? How much is everybody else's property tax now going to go up because of that private decision? There is a public cost to private decisions here. And this opens the door for me to have a real conversation about the future of our housing stock. And many times homes are the biggest source of equity for these seniors, right? 32% of seniors' net worth comes in the form of the equity of their homes. But many times when you talk to seniors about moving over into a different type of house, they're like, why would I? I own my house. Home equity also persists as a measure of growing community wealth. When the equity in our rural homes goes up, the wealth of our community goes up. Because again, a home is a community asset. It's an individual resource too, but it's also a community asset. But equity is not always seen as something to be tapped, but you can shift equity to a new asset. So, you know, why do people move? You know, people move to downsize, to reduce expenses. These people are going to be moving out more so, start a new chapter in life. Some people move out to be closer to family and friends. Some are moving into an aging friendly home or become widowed, or some people actually move into a larger home. So some people divorced or separated, right? We end up with all these situations. So really, I want to talk about people moving over. That when you have opportunities for people to move over, and this is like a patio home, right? When you have opportunities for people to move over, it opens up your housing stock. It opens up your housing stock for a new workforce. So, right, oh yeah, right here for new supply. But why don't people, again, I'll go back to those reasons that inhibit people to think about moving over. It's stressful, fear of losing independence, anxiety. However, I want to remind you that when you are stuck in emergency mode making decisions, when you are stuck in emergency mode making decisions, every one of these factors is pronounced. It is even more stressful when you have to do it in emergency mode. It is even more fearful. You have almost no control at that point. If my mom needs to move out of her 2-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house and into a facility, or needs to find something that's on a single floor living, you better hope there's something available, because we already know there's waiting lists for many of the things that we've got. But also at the same time, if we don't have opportunities for people to move over, they're going to move out. And now there's a public cost to them moving out and direct implications for our counties. So I just want to expand this conversation and look at an example of patio homes, right? They tend to be more manageable, they're senior friendly. And I'm not talking about, again, I'm not talking about senior housing for people with high medical needs. Like, I don't want to go around, I hear us all the time, like, I'm not moving into a facility with all the dead people, like all the people that are going to die. I mean, I'm saying this all tongue in cheek, right? But we have to have a real conversation about seniors at the end of life too. Well, meanwhile, right before end of life, there's still this continuum of life, and continuum of care. There's this continuum of life. So what are these? They're much more friendly in terms of upkeep. You can leave for 3 weeks and visit your kids and not have to worry about the place. So it's much more manageable as a place to move over to. So now you're saying, well, you know what? we're just going to let this happen, our laissez-faire approach again. And if you think that nobody else should be responsible for housing besides your HRA, I'm going to show you why economically. These seniors have a huge impact on your community already today, and will have a much bigger impact tomorrow by looking at something that's called transfer receipts. So when you think about all the income that's generated in your county every day or every month or every year, a lot of your income comes from a job, but it's usually in our rural communities no more than 60 or 65% of income comes from a job. About 20 to 30% comes from transfer receipts, and we'll look at this in just a second. And the other category comes from dividends, interest, and rent, right? If you're a renter or if you're a landlord, you're garnering income from a rent. So the point here is that not all income comes from a job, and we'll look at some of this. So here's Cheyenne County. Cheyenne County, just 48% of your income in the county comes from a job. Less than half of your income comes from a job. 28% comes from this category called transfer receipts. Transfer receipts are composed of old age Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, this does not include private retirement accounts like 401ks and Roth IRAs. This is your, when you get that that statement from the Social Security Administration, that 2-pager that you open up and says, when you retire, you're going to make $300 a month or whatever. Hopefully it's more than that, right? That you get that flyer. That's this. These are called transfers because they are transfers from the federal government into our local places. Now, retirement comes to the individual, but Medicare and Medicaid almost always goes through pass-throughs, right? It goes to your insurer, it goes to your pharmacy, it goes to your medical facilities. So right now, $1 in $4 in Cheyenne County is derived from a transfer receipt. And think about this. All of those dollars get spent and create jobs right now. Think of how many jobs you have dependent upon these transfer receipts, not just job, dependency, but retirement benefits and Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid, think of how many jobs are in your healthcare industry right now because of these transfer receipts. So my argument here is if you don't have anywhere for seniors to move over to, they're going to move out. And what happens if your seniors move out? They take this with them. Right? Because this stream of income follows individuals. And now if you don't have any move over housing, they're going to move out and take their transfer receipts with them. And if we look at the differentials between retirement and medical benefits too, they're almost hand in hand, about 52 to 40% of the transfer receipts are derived from those two categories. Smith County, roughly the same thing, about 30%. This is a very common kind of profile. 30% of the income comes from a transfer receipt, 28% from dividends, interest, and rent. We look across all these variety of counties. This is just a smattering from Northwest that I had done. Smith is in here too, what we looked at earlier. What percentage of your income in these counties come from transfer receipts? And what percent of your income comes from a job? Some of these counties are highly dependent upon the senior population right now, and that will only get bigger as we have more and more. Again, when you've got a third of your homes owned by people over the age of 75, but another 45% of your homes owned by baby boomers, they're just starting to earn those great amounts in retirement benefits. So your local economy is only going to become more integrated with boomer-related services, right? Senior-related services. And we should want, this is a value statement, this is my value statement, we should want to retain these transfer receipts, because right now a good portion of our economy is dependent upon them already. And maybe move over housing is the opportunity for us. Do we have enough move over housing? So now, Medicaid can actually inhibit choices to move due to home sales because those funds are counted against you. So I've learned a lot about Medicare and Medicaid, which again, I'm not a healthcare person. I'm not even a housing person. So I'm just trying to bring this together in a way that helps you understand some of the implications here. That, when we talk about seniors moving over, it may actually make you ineligible for medical cost coverage when you sell your house because that's counted against you that year in terms of income. So, senior housing opens up workforce housing. If you open up senior housing and open up that supply, it opens up the supply of where they were. I hope that makes sense. Like, you don't have a shortage of workforce housing. You've got plenty of it. It's currently occupied by your seniors. But if your seniors don't have anywhere to move over to, they're going to stay in their house. And now, what are the long-term costs in terms of on the individual and on the house? So for me, housing is the key. Housing is the key. A house is not just a private asset, but a community asset that persists over time. So what do we change? Like, you know, and I ask people, like, what are you trying? And it's like, I don't know, we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. Now, here is where I put my big disclaimer that I don't have a lot of answers. I don't have it, but these are the questions that people historically, as I presented over the past 3 years, have brought before me. Like, at what point do we make changes? Do you deal with these homes when they're vacant, or do you deal with new homes? And just by the way, I know the deal with new homes rarely happens because homes are expensive to build, right? And a lot of times in our rural communities, homes get built for $180,000 and immediately appraised at $160,000, right? So who's going to take a $20,000 hit for the good of the community? Well, maybe it is worth it, right? Maybe there are incentives we can help provide to ensure that we've got housing, because look at the long-term costs and benefits of keeping your seniors or losing your seniors. Because imagine, again, if you were to lose just 20% of your current seniors, and what kind of a hit would that have on your local economy? So, you know, what strategy do you work on? Do you work with potential buyers? Do you work with the sellers? Like, a lot of times, I know our states and the federal programs available that we have available to us help low-income households, and seniors a lot of times are low income. And for those that are, you know, if you deal with the house that they're in right now, you might actually get a program in place to help rehab that place, to get new insulation, to get that new wiring, to get the new windows. Where if you wait until it's sold, the potential new buyers may be at an income level higher than would be eligible for those state programs. But again, if you're looking at the house as a community asset and not just an individual, you should want to help get your homes updated at a community level and take access and gain access to the programs you currently have available. So even more so, we've got homes that need a lot of work, right? Between the plumbing, the electrical work, the insulation, some construction work that needs to be done. Like, there's some partners we could have that we've never had before, but we also know that they're in high demand. Construction folks, electricians, plumbers. Like, for me now, the talent pipeline here is vital. Our technical schools, letting our current crop of high school seniors and juniors know that there is a more than viable opportunity for you to go into these industries today and make a very good living. So really, there's some challenges here. We don't have a lot of good data regarding the conditions inside the house. You know, we don't really realize what kind of condition the house is in until it goes to be sold. And then, like, again, that story I shared earlier, like, hey, you've got knob and tube, or you've got some really old plumbing in this house, right? Or whatever it is. And so a lot of times we do, windshield surveys. We'll drive past and we'll look at, is there peeling paint? Does the siding look old? Is the roof old? But again, that doesn't tell you anything about what's going on inside the house. We've also got a lack of data regarding intentions by those living in the house. And I mean, actually talking to the people living there and not waiting for the laissez-faire approach to take place, which does not work, but really engaging seniors in a conversation about the future of their home. And we've also got a lack of data regarding the needs of those that want to live in the house. And to be clear, but I think part of this is that our seniors don't believe people actually want to live in their house, because the narrative is so negative around rural. They're like, well, when I sell the house, I don't know what's going to happen. Well, there's people that want to live there. We have this brain gain. There are actually people that want to live here all the time. So I think communicating the interest and demand that people have for rural living to these current residents is important to help make that transition over. Sometimes we have a challenge just with the people here. Right now, our seniors are barely engaged, and more importantly, their families. Usually this engagement period doesn't happen until you're in emergency mode, when something is forced upon you. So really, I encourage you all to do experience studies. And what I mean by this is talk to people who've been forced into the move. How did it go? Because spoiler alert, I know how it goes. It's usually not very good, right? You don't actually have choices when you're in emergency mode. You are stuck making a decision on a very limited decision basis. So if there's anything to do, it's start talking and sharing the stories with current seniors in your community that were forced into a move, and gain some strategies about how you could do things differently or make it easier for the next generation to move over or move out or whatever it is, or even stay in their home, right? Age in their place. So do you have it? So for those that do want to age in the place and their home is being kept up and all that, because I don't want to be called the guy that just wants to kick all the seniors out of their homes, right? Like, there are people that want to stay, and if their house is in good shape, great. But if you don't have services for those seniors either, how long are they really going to stay in their community? But for me, I have found one of the more successful things to do is appeal to the sense of continuity for the families and the community. What I mean is letting, like Joanne, my grandma, know that her house is actually desired. People want to live in this town, and people want to raise their kids here. They want to raise their families here. Like, your house is going to be a home to the next generation. But if your home is dilapidated, it's going to be very difficult for this town to have a future when we don't have houses. So now the people not here yet, right? I expand the conversation about housing in your community. How do we engage newcomers? You do have newcomers all the time. How are they being engaged? Can you talk to them about their experience, about how they found their house? Have they had to do rehabilitation in the home and things like that? So really, for me, the future of your community is in the hands of people that aren't here yet. Like, we are on the precipice of this major shift over the next 20 years in who is going to be living in our rural communities. So maybe, I call this rural housing wealth, right? Maybe one of the best things you can do for the future of your community is ensure there's somewhere for people to live. So now, I usually, again, when we do breakouts in this at a community level, we'll do things like I'll do roundtable questions for, a good 20, 30 minutes after this. But I just wanted to share it with you. Now, what problems and related solutions are you hearing in communities related to rural housing? When thinking about rural housing issues, what data or information do you wish you had or knew? And this has really led to all the research you've heard today, is people saying, well, I've heard this, now what? Now I want to know more about this, right? Who are unnatural partners in this work? And what about unnatural partners, right? We've really never engaged the construction agency much as a foundation. If you have a foundation that wants to do work on home rehab, for example, like, there's going to be unnatural partners in this, because traditionally in the past, housing decisions are based by the housing agencies. Like, oh, I don't need to worry about that. That's what we have the HRA for. Like, okay, well, it's everybody's issue now, right? And then what actions can we take? But I want to remind you that taking no action is an action too. And there's a cost to doing nothing. So really, we need to evaluate the kind of cost benefit of all of these things. Whew, it's 10:29. So I just went through a ton of stuff. Hopefully it was interesting and usable to y'all. So I think we've got a couple minutes for questions here too, but really, again, Nancy and the whole network that you've got there, just thanks for the opportunity to share what I've got here today. So I'm going to look through chat here.
Ben, thank you so much for all of that. I've been using your data for the last year in my first impressions presentations, and people are always surprised that there are people moving in. But when I ask them how many of you meet this definition, there have been times when half the room held up their hand.
Right.
It's just, the evidence is clear that anecdotally the data is real.
Right.
Yeah, very well.
So I do see a question here from Ron. What if there's a lack of fit between the housing of departed seniors and the housing of young professional, young families? The house being vacated is not the type of housing. Generally, we find that the younger generations are not super picky. I mean, to be honest, like, they are just super excited to be able to own a home. And again, we're talking about a generation of millennials, especially, that they went through and watched their parents go underwater. They are very careful about how they go about their home purchase. They are not going to outlay more than they want. But a lot of times right now, the research I see is we're immersed by housing studies that say millennials want to live in small footprint homes on small parcels, and that's patently false. The Pew Research Institute just did a study that came out 2 days ago that showed this generation, they want essentially what rural communities have. They want a yard, they want a house, but they are also not super picky about what it looks like. So I don't know exactly if that answers your questions, Ron, or if there was a specific house you're thinking of, or if like you've got a story of someone there. But yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Mike Pawson, Norton, Kansas. Thank you, Ben, for this presentation. It's wonderful. The data you were hearing on a few of the counties that showed the number of homes owned by which age bracket, could you point us on where to go to find that for our particular county?
Yeah, just American Community. Well, decennial census data is going to be much more reliable, which is what I typically only use. And that's the data that only comes out every 10 years, right? But there is American Community Survey data, which again has a huge asterisk next to it because there is a margin of error in ACS data. So ACS data might say, you know, you've got 1,400 homes plus or minus 180. Well, it's somewhere in between here. You don't really know what that number is, so I tend not to use that. I do use decennial census data, and so we'll have new census data come out soon, but I have been projecting some of those numbers based upon ACS data, but really I would just go to decennial census data. But another way to do this is if you're in a small town, you can just bean count this stuff out, like get a printout from your city clerk of the households and start, you know, taking people's stickers and putting them into their age categories, you know. It's very easy. That's what we did in Hancock, was we just put people on their sticker chart by age. We were kind of guessing in there, but we mostly knew where people were at.
We just completed in late 2019 a countywide housing study where we've put together a set of proposed housing rehab incentives that we're getting ready to go shop for some funding with our local community regional support partners, also getting ready to go to Topeka for a HIAC meeting, which is a housing interagency advisory committee meeting with Commerce Department, USDA, Rural Development, Kansas Housing Resource Commission, and Federal Home Land Bank to get some feedback on rounding out our program. One of our proposed incentives, because I had heard part of this presentation before at, I think you were presenting at the Hansen Forum, or maybe something similar. So we've seeded one of our proposed incentives. We're calling it a senior relocation incentive. I've got 6 different options in the community for move over locations, and I know I've got at least a dozen, if not 20 vacancies in those options right now. So we're looking at, I'm assuming we're going to be able to raise the funding for this, creating an incentive for if a senior in Norton County chooses to move into one of these move over locations in our county, we want to pay them a bump for having made that move, not to make the move, but who have made the choice to live in one of the locations in Norton County. Because I want to fill them up so that I can find incentives to build another one.
Right, awesome. Yeah, we find a lot of these patio homes, or I've seen housing developers basically, you know, as soon as they break ground, the places kind of get sold. Like, you know, there's just such a high demand for it. But I think there's still, again, a larger proportion of the population that is the I'm going to live here forever mentality, which ultimately those are the ones I'm more worried about, because I think those are a greater risk to just being removed from our supply.
I guess my question for you, Ben, on this is, can you see any backlash of offering a financial incentive if you were going to pay somebody a 5 or 10K bump to have made a choice to sell their home and relocate into one of our senior move over locations within the county?
Yeah, we've already seen backlash in a different model, which is a lot of times communities that offer free lots for things to be, for new homes to be built on. We found that like 75 to 80% of those strategies only end up being purchased by local residents. And then, so it's a local person that like, oh, there's a free lot with all the hookups and, you know, maybe some tax incentives or whatever. And then they build their new house there and they move out of theirs. Well, you just incentivized a family that already lived there, right? So, and yeah, we do hear that. We don't really hear a ton of backlash around it. I mean, it was just a little bit, and it surprised us, the idea that it wasn't people moving in from outside.
Yeah.
So yeah, I haven't heard much. There are so few, or there are so few places actually trying things around this that I'm happy to hear you are. So if you get a chance, can you email me a brief description of your?
Yeah, sure.
I would love to add it.
One of the fears we're chasing, I've seen a trend just in a small community, you know everybody, so you know what they're doing. But having seen several sets of grandparents sell their homes and move somewhere closer to a metro area to live close to grandkids after, they're empty nest, all their kids and grandkids are more near another part of the state.
Right. Yeah, and there's nothing you can do about people moving out. My point is, for those that are going to move out, you let them go, but that'll open up your supply. It's the people that are staying. But especially too, I mean, kind of related to that is, you've got folks who raise their kids there and then the kids are gone or whatever. And part of this best intentions narrative that seniors have is that, I'm going to keep this big house because I want somewhere for my kids and grandkids to come, but then they never really come, like the reality of the situation is very different than what the intentions are. Mm-hmm. So I see a comment here, LD Zimmer, a study been done in Missouri. The data is roughly the same. I do this nationally. The data is very similar in every location across the country. Good way besides door to door, Luke. Hey, Luke. A good way besides door to door to find out the age? Not really. Again, in the smaller towns, it's fairly easy to do that. You can kind of get a small group of people together with a list of all your homeowners and just take their mailing labels and put them in the right age category or close enough kind of area. There's a good comment there. To answer Ron, there's a comment here from Cole. I think the younger people will adapt to whatever housing. Skipped up here. Whatever housing is available and make it their own. Some younger people now prefer two-story older homes that they can remodel. I mean, that's true. I see this all the time. That, I don't believe we actually don't have homes for people. People are just generally, these younger people are so happy to own a home that it's kind of unbelievable. The kind of just gratitude they have for the opportunity to actually be a homeowner in a rural community where, again, they watch their parents go underwater. They may have lived in the metro and everything was unaffordable there. So our small towns have a very distinct competitive advantage here. Yeah, to get kids to come home. So Virginia talking about that. Yeah, bringing kids back. Returnees is one strategy. Returnees make up about a third of new people moving in. And 2/3 of people are not from your community. But again, low-hanging fruit, like go to your school, all school reunions and things, if you want to encourage your kids to come back. But I think it even starts before that. For me, the get kids to come home strategy starts with how you talk about your place while they're kids here. Because as their kids are going to school in your community, if the narrative is super negative in your town, they're going to think they never could. Like, I could never move here. All I heard was I needed to get out to be successful, or that this town sucks now. There's nothing here. It's not like it used to be. The narrative matters more than you think. And I think for me, the biggest strategy for a positive narrative for returnees, because they already know about your place. You don't need to market to them. They know about your place. For me, it starts when they're in high school. That is the best opportunity for you to build that positive narrative. So, but with others, here in Minnesota, we've got about a dozen rural recruitment initiatives. And these are groups that are trying to recruit people in from metro, from non-metro. It's building a positive narrative and finding a way to either connect with visitors, to connect with real estate agents. It's like all of these multifaceted strategies that people end up in about trying to recruit people in.
And Ben, I would add, from our first impressions experience, one of the things that we tell them based on your research is that your school website needs to understand that it's a marketing tool for people outside of your district, not just what day are we having hot dogs this week, but why do we love our schools? What's awesome about our schools? If we ask you, but you're not telling strangers. You're not, to Virginia's point, that person that's looking at for communities can't tell why you love your school.
Right. Luke, I don't really have a sample survey. I just kind of, every community, I just give kind of recommendations, those broad strokes at the end of those slides. But I mean, we're at the beginning of this. I just don't have any answers. Sorry. This is, the data just tells me, like, you remember at the beginning, I told you at the end of this, you can't say you don't see this coming. Like, this is coming, this huge boulder is coming at you, and we've got an opportunity to kind of control it or not control it. So this is our option. But you know, everybody on here, you all smart people, you can come up with questions too, and if you don't get it right the first time, you'll have another opportunity. This is a slow moving ball coming toward us. So.
Yeah. Well, Ben, this was amazing, and I'm going to assume that if anybody has anything they want to share, they will email it to me, and I'll email it out to the rest of you. So Mike asked if there would be a copy of these are always recorded and put on our website, and so I'll send you a link to that when it's up. But Ben, and I know for sure that they are twice as often watched online than they are watched live, which amazes me. It's a generational thing, but 2.5 times as many people watched it last time online than watched it live. So thank you all for being here. I want to encourage you with a thought for, our next speaker next month is Ashla Stowe. Ashla had to reschedule, but she is the program manager for the Work Opportunity Tax Credit Program that we thought we were going to hear about last month. And her program will tell us about programs that incentivize and support hiring people that don't have strong employment backgrounds. Those people might be TANF recipients, veterans, ex-felons, or SNAP recipients, and others. Really highly incentivized and supported work programs. So that should be of interest to us all. Besides jobs and employees, housing, besides housing, employees is another big thing for us all over the place. So I'll send you the link to Ben's presentation. And Ben, will you send me your PowerPoint too, so that we can post that?
Oh, surely, I will.
Oh, you've
within
so
minutes.
You're so generous. Thank you. Okay, so next time then we'll see you next month. And your thought for the day is sooner or later, the critics move on. Sooner or later, the ones who told you that this isn't the way it's done, the ones who found time to sneer, they will find someone else to hassle. Sooner or later, your work speaks for itself, says Seth Godin. Thanks everybody for joining us. And Ben, thanks again.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Nancy. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.